I want to share some tips and techniques with you today on stitching teeny tiny stems. I know applique can be intimidating on its own, especially hand applique, and if you see a block that's got really skinny little stems in it, I know a lot of you think there's just no way I can do that. But trust me, you can. If you follow a few simple tips, I think you'll be surprised at how easy it really is. Now the quilt on the table here is from my Heaven Sent pattern, and these are little 4-inch blocks, and every single one of these blocks just about has little stems in it. You can see the ones here, and in most of the blocks they measure about 1/8 of an inch, and yes, they are done with stitched with fabric, appliqued by hand on both sides, and I'm going to share with you the things that I use that make that go a lot easier. Some of it is going to be your tools. And when I do my hand applique, I usually use either number 100 silk or a 60 weight cotton. The spool that I'm going to be using in our demonstration today is a 50 weight cotton, and that's working just fine too. I choose the cotton over the silk on these tiny stems because it grabs the fabric a little bit better. It's not as slippery, and you want to have your stitches really hold when you're working with this. So pick a color that's going to match your applique fabric and use either a 60 or a 50 weight cotton. The needle that you use can make a difference too. You need to be able to manipulate the fabric, and I use a number 10 applique needle, and there's a few reasons why I really like this one. It's long, and it gives me the ability to use the end of the needle like a tool to maneuver the fabric when I'm turning under the seam allowance. And it has a large eye in it, which for me it makes it easier to thread, so you don't have any problem with your cotton thread. But when I do a lot of back basting, and when I back baste tiny stems like this, I use quilting thread, for your back basting. And instead of using the crewel needle, I'll use the same applique needle, and because of the large eye, I'm able to thread it with the quilting thread. Now, being a long needle, this one is strong, so you shouldn't have too much trouble with it bending. But even if it does, that might not be all bad because it's going to bend kind of to fit your finger. And because you're using it as a tool, it's kind of like your personalized seam allowance turner underer, if that makes sense to you. So if you haven't tried these needles, give them a whirl. The size 10 is a pretty hefty one, like I said. If you do an 11 or a 12, those are going to be way too thin, and I think you really will have trouble with bending. So size 10 applique needle. And then even if I'm back basting, I like to have my line so that I can see it, and it's really important with these tiny stems, and you'll see that when we get to the stitching, because you need to be able to see the beginning and the end of your stitching line. So this white pencil is one of my favorites. I use it on just about every fabric that I can. I don't have to worry about it, not washing out or causing any harm to the fabric, and it glides on the fabric really nicely so it doesn't drag when you're pulling it along. So I suggest that one. I do admit that I also use the Frixion pens. I know there's a lot of controversy over these, but for marking your seam line, it's going to be turned under. I guess I'm not gonna, I just try to not think about that. I enjoy the process. This tool works great for me, but I have to, be fair and say test it on your fabric if you're worried about it. If it's not for you, just use a regular marking pencil. It's not going to matter. Scissors. If you've got a pair of the allowance scissors that I used to use, that's wonderful. Those are a little bit hard to find, and I have found a new favorite. These are Havel's scissors, and these are important, especially on these tiny stems, because you need precision in where you make your clips and how far in the seam allowance you make those clips. These are serrated scissors. They're really sharp, right to the tip. They feel so good in your hands, and I have great control over cutting my thread and my seam allowance. So let's get to stitching some of these. I'm going to pull in a block that I'm working on, and hopefully you can see, because I'm back basting this one, the design is marked on the wrong side. Now, even if you mark your design on the right side, you're still going to follow a lot of these same procedures. You'll see what I mean as we get moving along. But for back basting this, You can see I've got some already stitched, but we also, let's get ready to cut some of our fabric pieces. Here's one I haven't done yet. So you need to cut a piece of fabric that you can use on this particular stem, and this one is, well, that's going to be 1/8 of an inch wide too by the time we get it stitched. But you need to know what size piece of fabric to cut for your stem. So you're going to want to use your ruler and lay it over there, and you can see pretty much, hopefully you can see this, a 1-inch square is going to give me a piece big enough to cover that area. So I have pre-cut some of these little pieces of fabric, and we're going to get one into position here. And when I go to put this on here, it's going to be hard to see, but I don't line this up with the straight grain. I try to have it so that it's just kind of on the diagonal. So you're working with a bias a little bit, and if you hold this up to the light, you'll be able to see it. I can kind of see through this, so I'm going to hope that I got that in the right spot. We're just going to forge ahead. I'll try and flip this over. Well, another way you could do it is put a pin at the beginning, put a pin at the end, flip it over, see where your pins are coming up, and you can see I've got plenty of room here for seam allowance at both ends and on the sides. So I'll get those out of there, and we're going to go with this. Now I've got one of the applique needles threaded with my quilting thread, and for the back basting I want you to go right from the beginning of the stitching line, take small stitches through there, and I want you to stop that at the other end. I've got that held enough I can get that pin out of there. Pull this in, we'll leave our tail. Not even going to cut my thread right now, I'm just going to go right on down the other side here. And you have to take smaller back basting stitches than you would if you were going on a larger piece, simply because sometimes you only get 1 or 2 stitches in there to hold it all together. Okay, get that in there. I'm going to leave a loop at that end. I'm going to grab my scissors. Okay, we're going to cut that there, and I'll split that little loop apart. And you can see on the other side here, right there, we've got our stitching, our back basting lines. Now, once you lift one of those stitches out, you can't see where to start and stop, and that's kind of an important thing. So I want you to take your marking pencil and mark right from the beginning of that line to the end of that line and go right over that back basting. Now, can you see how I've got that marked? Now we can do our cutting. Now when you're cutting your seam allowance to go around this piece, on each side of that teeny tiny stem, I want you to cut leaving just a good 1/8 of an inch on both sides. But at the ends, go ahead and give yourself a good 1/4 of an inch. I'd rather that you have too much there than not enough, because you can always go back when you're covering it up with a stem or a berry or flower or whatever it is and trim that back. But if it's not there, you're in trouble. So, okay, now in order to stitch one of these, I'm going to grab my thread here. Although maybe before I do that, let's talk about if you had marked your applique design on the right side of your fabric. I do that a lot with my applique too, and I mark my shapes so that I'm like 1/8 of an inch inside what the actual line is. But when I have these teeny tiny stems, rather than marking both sides of that line, I just do one line down the center. Then I've got a freezer paper template on my little piece of fabric, which, you know, you would mark around that too. And then, let's see, quick, cut these out here, cut these little lines. Get us our 1/4 inch at the end. And then when you went, you could just center that over the line and you would pin it in place. But like I said, this block is back basted, so let's get back to that. Flip it over. We'll get one of these. Okay, when you go to stitch, I don't come up from the wrong side. I come up through the applique piece, and I want you to insert your needle so that it comes up right at the beginning of that stitching line. I hope you can see this okay. Then this first side is kind of a shorty, so I'm going to just take the entire back basting thread out of there, and I still have my drawn line, so I'm okay there. Use your needle like a tool and just push that seam allowance under, and use your thumb on the hand that's holding the block like a little pressing iron. Maneuver that seam allowance under there, and then just give it a tight press with your finger. And I want you to take small applique stitches. Your knot's going to get hidden within the little stem, and stitch only to the end of that stitching line. Don't go out into your seam allowance, because remember, we left that a little bit longer, and if you're working on a really small block and you need to trim that back, you don't want to trim into your stitching. Now, if you're having trouble seeing exactly, am I to the end of the line or not, I just insert my needle, flip it over, and there I can see I've got a little bit more to stitch. So let's take a few more stitches. And it's really hard to get these exactly perfect, and if you could look closely at the back of mine, you'll see they're not perfect. Okay, now can you see that needle? I'm right to the end of that stitching line. So I've got my needle, my thread on the top. I'm going to rotate my work, and if it's a longer length tiny stem, just take out these first couple threads. Use the needle to grab your basting thread, pull that up. I kind of tuck it back, hold it with my finger, and I think I want one more out of there. This is a shorty, so we can get quite a ways. Okay, now there's the end of my marked line right there, and that's where I want to start. And call me lazy or what, but I'm not going to go all the way to the back and come back up. I'm going to tuck that under, kind of keep the beginning of that line in my mind's eye, and I'm just going to go scoot underneath with my needle, come right up there where I need that stitch to be, pull that across, and I'm going to start down the other side. Now, this is where it gets highly technical. This is what I call stitch and cram, and this is how you're going to make these as tiny as you want them to be. Just use your needle and start pulling that seam allowance underneath there. Use your thumb to finger press it, and start stitching down this side. Now, I'm using a regular quilting weight cotton. If you had a fabric that was a little bit heavier and you were having a hard time getting that turned, that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance turned under, before you got to the second side, we could have flipped that back. Maybe I can show you by pulling this end up here. You could have flipped this back and trimmed even a little bit more off from the seam allowance on that first side, just to give yourself a little bit of extra room. So I'm gonna use my needle, just tuck it under there, just cram, stitch and cram. Use your thumb, like I said, like a little iron. Take your tiny stitches along there. And you can see it's really not any more difficult than doing any other section of applique. I think it's just a matter of using the cotton thread, the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, using your needle to push it under, giving it a press with your thumb, and taking small stitches. And here again, if you're not sure where you're at, take a stitch, flip it over, look on the back side, and see how much further you've got to go if you're doing it back basting. Of course, if you got your markings on the front, it's a little bit easier to see. Okay, now I want to talk about one other area on this particular block that might help you if you encounter this. You can see there's tiny stems coming in here on all of these little cherries. Well, instead of doing each one of these as an individual piece, do this as one long swoop. You won't have any bulk, or you won't have to worry about a break or making things meet here in the center. And if you're back basting, just start with a piece that's wide enough to go across the whole thing. So I will get us set up and do some trimming, and we'll stitch another piece. I prepped one of the double stems, and I've got one side partly stitched. So I'm going to work around to this end here. I wanted to show you about clipping the curves on these tiny stems. Normally, when we clip the seam allowance on an inside curve on applique, you know, we always talk about clipping all the way to the line. Well, these seam allowances are so narrow, and the piece itself is so narrow, that you want to be careful to maintain the integrity of the fabric, especially, you know, if you're working with a lighter weave. So we don't want to do the same kind of clipping that we would do regularly. I got to see if I'm all the way to the end of my line here. That white marking pencil is wonderful, but I can, there I am. You can see we're pretty close. About one more stitch, and I think we'll have it. Okay, now this is doing the double stem at once. Okay, I'm going to just get my needle in there because I know that's my last stitch. And I'm hoping you can see my seam allowance here. You can see we've got a pretty good inside curve. Now, I did cut this one. I should probably trim it down because I want it to be about 1/8 of an inch. I got a little bit more there than on that one end than I would normally have. Okay, here's where these sharp serrated Havel scissors come in wonderfully. I don't want you to clip all the way to the line like I was talking about. I just want you to clip about halfway. So use the tip of the scissors and just give it 3 little clips halfway into that 1/8 inch. So believe it or not, it's only 1/16 of an inch, but it's just enough that'll ease that a little bit. And because we've stitched all along this top side, I don't really need to keep my back basting threads all in there. So my stitching on the other side is going to hold this piece in place for me. So I'm going to use my needle on a stitch and get a hold of it. And I'm just going to pull that whole thing out. Now, here's where, if this seam allowance from your first line of stitching is keeping you from getting your seam allowance on the second edge turned under to make your stem small enough, you can go in here with those sharp scissors and go right ahead. You can trim that back just a little bit, but you have to remember, when you're stitching your first side down, even the second side, you want to make sure that you're taking your stitches close together and using this cotton thread, because you're matching your fibers cotton to cotton. It's what's going to make this strong and secure on your block. So we've stitched our first side, we've clipped halfway into the seam allowance on the second side, and you just use the end of your needle, work and cram it in there. Use your thumb like a little pressing iron. Press down on that piece. I'm going to scoop my needle under here, come right up through the fold on that second side, and I'm going to start stitching this down. And go slow. You don't want to get, you know, it's easy to get your thread tangled up on the ends, and just use your needle, maneuver that, hold it with your thumb, give it a press. You can see I've got that turned under quite a ways. And you're just going to want to take tiny stitches coming up through the fold. And here again, you don't want to stitch too far. You want to stop at the end of your stitching line. But what's going to be great about this piece is, let's get that, work that under there. Use your needle to swoop it in, your thumb to kind of press it, hold it in place until you can get it stitched. Pull your stitches nice and snug. Get that cotton thread to set right down in the fabric. Take a little more. Now, like I said, doing 2 of these at once, what's going to be really nice So you can see on the back how nice and smooth and flat that is. When this stem goes on there, you're not going to have any bump or bulk to distort your design. So I love to do, if I can, the two at once. And on this one, right up above it, I would do those together too. You're just going to come down, that's going to be a point, and you're going now this is going to have a V because it's a little bit more arced. So you would do a couple of little half clips into the seam allowance on those sections where you have that V. It's going to get hidden anyway, and you're not going to have to worry that you get the V, you know, stitched down secure. You just want to make it nice and flat. So in that case, you could clip all the way to the seam allowance. So if you give these, you know, suggestions a try and you feel like it still doesn't work for you, there's no crime in doing something else on your blocks. You know, these little ones, this is less than 1/4 of an inch, but not as small as 1/8 for a stem, and that one is stitched out of fabric. But I've got a couple others where if you want to, use some pearl cotton and just do a chain stitch to do for your stems. Whatever you do, enjoy the process. And if you've got any questions or something that I didn't make clear, you can email me. You can reach me on the website. It's sentimentalstitches.com. Happy quilting!